Welcome, LA Progressive friends and family. Dick and I are so delighted to have with us today a dear friend and a brilliant and prolific thought leader. Her name is Michele Goodwin. And Michele works on all kinds of constitutional law and health policy. She writes for Ms. Magazine, has written commentary in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Nation Magazine, CNN, The LA Times. Her CV goes on and on for pages. Believe me, I know. Welcome, Michele. Thank you for being with us. So, we've invited you here today because of a piece that you have published in Ms. Magazine entitled The King Can Do No Wrong: Trump Immunity and the Death of Accountability. Michele, enlighten us.
Well, the piece comes less than a week that the 47th president is now in office again. The inauguration was on Monday, and the piece was published on the Saturday. And towards the end of the week, the president announced that security support was being yanked from Pompeo, who was the former Secretary of State, from Fauci, Dr. Fauci, who had served in government for more than 50 years, including during the period where we were at the peak of COVID and had been an advisor to President Biden, but of course was advising the world during the peak of COVID in 2020 and 2021. And with known death threats that come from the Department of Justice and also other investigatory arms of the government, it was very clear that these were people whose lives have been under threat. There have been people, in the case of Dr. Fauci, who have actually been prosecuted and have pled guilty to threatening to kill, harm, in one case, an individual who wrote to Dr. Fauci that, in a credible way, that he wanted to kill him, drag him down the street, then set his body on fire. So with these known threats against these individuals, including when you think about Pompeo, who came under threat after carrying out policies and programs from the prior Trump administration, and now there are known threats as recent as President Biden's administration, noting these. So the piece together, just laying that out, thought about this immunity case. And in the immunity case involving Donald Trump, the hypotheticals that had been put forward was whether the president would be absolutely immune from criminal punishment if he had Navy SEALs Team 6 take out his enemies, et cetera. And there was this kind of joking around it, but his lawyer said, well, yes, he would be immune from that. Now, there is nothing that rises to any level of criminal wrongdoing by saying we will no longer provide security for you. Not at all. And some people might think that it's just petty and small. But if you think about it, and I spent time thinking about Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent and the dissent of Justice Sotomayor, what does it mean when you know that these individuals have a bullseye on their heads and you pull their security? What is that? How close does it come to the actual hypotheticals that were part of what were the oral arguments when the Supreme Court heard the case, part of the oral arguments when the Circuit Court of Appeals heard the case? And I wanted to surface that at a time in which increasingly people are very much afraid to speak to law and order and rule of law.
You know, it's interesting that you said that people are afraid, because I get the sense that regular people definitely are afraid. People who are undocumented are afraid. But I also believe that elected officials are afraid. Cori Bush, who was a congressional representative representing in the state of Missouri, she had a fundraiser out here in California because she didn't have sufficient security. And she was raising funds so that she could have enough money to pay for her own security. She's no longer a congressional representative. But I wonder if other politicians are also afraid of having any any of their security polled
Well,
by
I
Donald
do
Trump.
think you're right. So I think that the spectrum of fear, which needs to be talked about, is something that is real. So there's a spectrum of fear that can be seen amongst members of his party who are concerned about stepping out of line. And you can see the distinction between what that looks like compared to, let's say, the era of Nixon, where there were actually people of that party, which is also the Republican Party, who in part led the way for Nixon's impeachment and ultimately his leaving office, right? And you could even see that during the Reagan administration, Bush 1 and Bush 2, where there were members of the party who came forward and said, well, not so much. Let's put the brakes on this. We think that civil liberties and civil rights happen to be important. And in this case, what you see is being lockstep. And then that's also then different from people who are worried about potential harm to their bodies and potential death, which is also part of the atmosphere here. Part of what's taken shape in this last week are a number of pardons, including the pardons of individuals who were part of January 6th and who engaged in significant violence and threat, not only against our government, which is significant because that's a threat against democracy and the principles we hold dear and value, but also threats against members of Congress and even the vice president.
Yeah,
The vice
these
president.
hypotheticals are in some ways they're pointing backwards towards Pompeo and Dr. Fauci and people and other people who might have crossed Trump over the past 4 years or past 8 years. But a big part of it is a warning to his current uh, administration. In over the past 4 years, a few members of his past administration stepped out and tried to tell the truth. And but now the message is loud and clear that they won't get any kind of protection. And Trump enjoys being vindictive and nasty, but he's also keeping people in line with these statements he's making.
That's exactly right, Dick. That's in fact that culture of fear, if you would, right? So we can name that as a what is being created here is a culture. It's a cultural norm that includes the people who serve to advise. And that says a lot too, just about what we can expect in terms of democratic principles and values and the advising of the president. One of the things that has really been, I think, the best of America has been when there are presidents who have advisors and those advisors are honest. And those advisors will say, it might be problematic if we do X or Y. You should think about these other alternatives. Here's how we might think of rolling out this plan. If your advisors happen to be fearful that somehow there might be retribution if they actually give good, sound advice, then that actually is dangerous for government. That's actually dangerous for our democracy. It undermines our democracy, right? All leaders should avail themselves to hearing counter narratives, counter points of view. But to the point that you're making, Dick, if you have the people who surround you afraid to be vocal, express their opinions, express their expertise, then it is the president that's losing out. And then that could mean that really it's the country that's losing out and is having to sacrifice because of it.
Yeah, so I wonder how many people are going to get a spine and stand up to him. It was really interesting that middle of the night he fired a bunch of inspector generals, and then they got to put their heads together and say, no, the law says you have to inform Congress 30 days ahead of time, and we're not going to leave office, which is a pretty ballsy move. And really the Democratic Party is kind of on its heels and in disarray. But here and there, I mean, we just saw Adam Schiff push back hard against Trump, and I think others will. I don't imagine very many Democrats or Republicans will, but eventually I'm hoping that people will get their sea legs and fight against his preposterous moves. The problem is that he has overwhelmed every part of government with all his kingly proclamations, it's going to be hard to fight him.
You've put a lot on the platter there, Dick, and it's all so smart and things for us to unpack. So one aspect of it happens to be where there are civil servants who'll say, well, we understand the law, we understand our roles, and we understand what the limitations of your power happens to be as a president. The distinction, in fact, between a president and a king, and even a king doesn't have exclusive power and authority. But what they're saying is that we understand the rules too, and you've just misread the rules. And we're going to play by what the actual rules are, and we're going to hold you accountable to those. And so we're not just going to go out easy in that kind of way. And that's really important. And so in that way, how important is it for Americans and for those who are serving in government and various other capacities to understand what their rights happen to be, to understand how government functions? And so that's one piece. The other piece that you mentioned is a Democratic Party that's in disarray. It has been for some time without necessarily having a clear narrative agenda, let's say. So much of what we understand is narrative, right? And so I want to spend a moment on just what narrative means and how Republicans have been able to carry out narrative. And in fact, we don't even have to think Republican, Democrat, but we could think about those who care about constitutional values, civil liberties and civil rights, and those who have not. So we've been in a very long loop and echo chamber of those who don't care about civil liberty, civil rights, and constitutionalism, right? Those are the people who made stereotypes, right? That the people who would be better endowed to be able to carry out government were people who were property gentry, who were white. That's just a stereotype and a stigma. There are people who did not have wealth, who in fact had very serious commitments to democracy. And then we see another form of narrative that justifies slavery, that suggests that Black people, are of no higher intelligence and were just simply born to be involved as people who were subordinate and enslaved. We get that narrative coming out of the Dred Scott decision. It's narrative. And we get a Jim Crow narrative as well that actually turns its head on slavery, that suggests, well, Black people were just so lazy, right? Which doesn't actually comport with the slavery story, right? Because if they were so lazy, they wouldn't have been good people for American slavery. But these things are narratives. We get the narrative about the gallant, right? The victorious Confederate, who were not that because they were not victorious at all and were not all that gallant, wanting to, and in fact, being engaged in enslaving people, in raping women, in raping children. Right? But all of these things are narrative. And today, there's another narrative. There's a Project 2025 narrative that's telling people about the way in which life should be, or a MAGA narrative telling people about it used to be great. Right? And so you raise a question about, well, what is the narrative of Democrats? Or what is the narrative of people who care about constitutionalism, about civil liberties and civil rights? And it seems to me that that's really lacking. But to your point, there are some people who are really trying hard, in fact, to remind people about what constitutionalism means, what civil liberties mean, and what civil rights mean. And in fact, to just make the story a little bit more complex, to sort of see where we are as a nation. Prior to about a decade or so ago, overwhelmingly, you had Republicans that voted for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act without a question. We had a couple decades ago, just more than a couple decades ago, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the 1990s, coming on to the Supreme Court with less than a handful of no votes, meaning very strong bipartisan support. If you think about what's taken place in our country, there's been a real divide on who cares about democracy, who cares about constitutionalism, who cares about civil liberties and civil rights. And we talk about it as if it's Republican and Democrat, and that's visually what it seems like. But, I would just say that the risks of talking about it just in that way are really, really high.
Michele, I would love to have another conversation with you about what you just talked about, because I often talk about how we lived through the Jim Crow years. We lived through state-sanctioned segregation. Now, we don't have state-sanctioned segregation, but we have socially accepted segregation. And so while we make these distinctions between Democrats and Republicans, the lives that we live show me that the problems we have along the racial divide and along the gender divides, those problems are problems that cross the aisle.
You are so right. Oh, Sharon, we've gone there. Yes, and we could have an episode on that, like liberal racism, right?
Yes.
Which is right now hard to hear because there are folks who say, well, let's just focus on something else, on the house that's burning down. Why talk about liberal racism? But in part, liberal racism has been a contributing factor to where we are now, right? Save for liberal racism, why was Jesse Helms in the Senate as long as he was? Save for liberal racism, tolerating Jesse Helms and his sexism, homophobia, and blatant racism, right? I mean, this is a person who was very vocal about how he felt in these kinds of ways. If you have certain democratic principles, civil libertarian, civil rights principles, you say, well, okay, maybe I want Jesse Helms over for Thanksgiving, but I don't think that he should be my colleague in the Senate.
That's right.
And I actually think that there should be a zero tolerance for some of that. And so that's that failure amongst liberals, which has to be addressed. And I'll add one more piece to that. If you think about the reproductive health rights justice context, it's that too, right? Because as Black women were being dragged out of hospitals in shackles and chains during the crack scare, right? And you had organizations that had significant endowments, right? That could have put an end to all of that. They could have said, those are our sisters. How dare you drag them out of hospitals and shackles and chains off of this made up, these made up stereotypes and stigmas. I mean, today, the Journal of American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, they will no longer publish articles that even use that terminology of crack mom. They won't. But where were these organizations that were feminist organizations? There were women's rights organizations, there were reproductive rights organizations. As these women were giving birth on prison toilets, prison concrete floors, being shackled and chained to gurneys, and bloodied gowns being taken into police cars, all under the notion that somehow these women were violating fetal personhood. And this was decades before the Dobbs decision, decades before Roe v. Wade was overturned. That's not just conservative. The people who are leading these organizations would consider themselves liberals and progressives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is where I think our fight really is. Hannah Arendt talks about the banality of evil. During the Nazi reign in Germany and after the end of the Holocaust, she attended a lot of the trials. And her observation was that the horrors of that period were really supported by good people who said and did nothing. And that's what she called the banality of evil. So, Michele, I think we'll end on that note, but with an open invitation to return and go into more depth in the areas that you teach and that you so eloquently deliver these messages that I believe progressives and liberals all need to hear. We're going to link to your story in Ms. Magazine, The King Can Do No Wrong, Trump Immunity and the Death of Accountability. And I understand that there is at the bottom, there's an embedded interview with you and Dr. Fauci, and I haven't listened to that yet. So we want to encourage people to follow that and to listen to the podcast with Michele Goodwin and Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you and Dick. Thank you so much for the work you do.
Yes, thank you, Michele.
Yeah, we miss you out here. We wish you were back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Michele.
Okay, so long.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.